The garage door slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed through my bones. In my trembling hands, I clutched the thin blanket Jessica had thrown at me, along with a pillow that smelled of motor oil and dust. "This is where you belong now," she had said, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the doorframe as she surveyed my new sleeping quarters with satisfaction. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood there among the garden tools and Christmas decorations, staring at the concrete floor where my son's wife expected me to sleep. At 73 years old, after raising 4 children and working 2 jobs to keep food on the table, I never imagined I'd be homeless in my own family. But Jessica didn't know about the safety deposit box downtown. She didn't know about the stocks my late husband had carefully hidden away. She had no idea that the frail old woman she was humiliating had been sitting on a fortune that could change everything. It started 6 months ago when my son Marcus brought Jessica home for the first time. I was in my small kitchen making Sunday dinner, the same meal I'd prepared every week for 30 years. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, green bean casserole, and my famous apple cobbler that had won ribbons at the county fair. The house smelled like home, like love, like the kind of comfort that comes from decades of family tradition. Marcus walked through the front door of the modest ranch house where I'd lived since 1987, his arm wrapped around the waist of a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Jessica Monroe was stunning in that polished, expensive way that immediately made me conscious of my worn apron and sensible shoes. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, her makeup flawless despite the humid August heat, and her sundress probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. "Mom, I want you to meet Jessica," Marcus said, his voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard since he was a teenager showing off his first car. "Jessica, this is my mother, Dorothy." I wiped my hands on my apron and extended one toward her with a genuine smile. I'd been looking forward to this moment for weeks. Marcus had been talking about Jessica nonstop during our weekly phone calls, and I was thrilled that my youngest son had finally found someone who made him happy. At 41, Marcus had been through his share of heartbreak, and seeing the light in his eyes when he mentioned Jessica had filled my heart with hope. Jessica took my hand briefly, her grip limp and cool, her smile sharp as glass. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, though something about the way she said it made my name sound like a burden. "Marcus has told me so much about you." The emphasis she placed on "so much" felt loaded with meaning I couldn't quite decipher. I chose to ignore the strange undertone and focus on the positive. This was my son's girlfriend, potentially the woman who might give me grandchildren and become part of our small family. I wanted desperately for us to get along. "Please, call me Dorothy," I said warmly, stepping back to take her in properly. "I hope you're hungry. I've made enough food to feed an army, which is what happens when you spend 40 years cooking for a family." Jessica's eyes swept over my kitchen with barely concealed disdain. I saw her take in the outdated appliances, the wallpaper I'd hung myself in 1995, the collection of ceramic roosters that had belonged to my mother. Her nose wrinkled slightly, as if she'd detected an unpleasant odor, though I kept my house spotless. "How quaint," she murmured, then turned to Marcus with a bright smile that transformed her entire face. "Darling, why don't you show me around while your mother finishes up in here?" The word darling dripped with honey, but there was something performative about it, like she was trying too hard to establish her claim on my son. Marcus beamed at her attention and eagerly led her toward the living room, pointing out family photos and sharing stories about his childhood. I could hear Jessica's polite laughter echoing through the house, but it sounded hollow, mechanical. During dinner, I watched Jessica pick at her food with the delicate precision of someone who considered eating a necessary evil rather than a pleasure. She complimented the meal in ways that felt more like subtle criticisms. "This is so hearty," she said, cutting her pot roast into tiny pieces. "I'm sure it's very filling." When I offered her seconds, she patted her flat stomach and laughed. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly. I have to watch my figure, you know?" Marcus hung on her every word, completely oblivious to the undercurrents I was sensing. He told her stories about growing up in this house, about the tree fort we'd built in the backyard, about the time he'd broken his arm falling off his bicycle, and how I'd driven him to the hospital while wearing my pajamas and house slippers. Jessica listened with the kind of polite attention people reserve for boring stories they can't escape, occasionally making appropriate noises of interest. Marcus was such a sweet little boy, I said, hoping to share some warmth with this woman who might become my daughter-in-law. Always bringing me flowers from the neighbor's garden, though I had to explain about asking permission first. Jessica's smile was razor-thin. How precious. It's wonderful that you have such detailed memories of his childhood. Some mothers can be so, attached to their sons. The comment hit me like a slap, though she delivered it with such sweetness that Marcus didn't even notice the barb. I felt my cheeks flush, but I forced myself to smile and change the subject. Maybe I was being oversensitive. Maybe Jessica was just nervous about meeting her boyfriend's mother for the first time. After dinner, as I cleared the dishes, I heard Jessica whispering to Marcus in the living room. I couldn't make out the words, but her tone was urgent, insistent. When they returned to the kitchen, Marcus looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes as he spoke. Mom, Jessica and I have been talking, and we think maybe it would be better if we went back to her place tonight instead of staying here like we planned. My heart sank. I'd been looking forward to having Marcus stay overnight, to making him his favorite pancakes in the morning, to spending more time getting to know Jessica. Of course, I said, forcing brightness into my voice. Whatever makes you both comfortable. Jessica stepped closer to Marcus, slipping her arm through his in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate. It's just that I'm not really used to this kind of environment, she said, gesturing vaguely around my kitchen. I hope you understand. I understood perfectly. My home wasn't good enough for her. My cooking wasn't sophisticated enough. I wasn't sophisticated enough. But I smiled and nodded because I loved my son and wanted him to be happy, even if it meant swallowing my pride and pretending that Jessica's casual cruelty didn't sting. That night, after they left, I sat in my empty kitchen and wondered what I'd done wrong. I replayed every conversation, every gesture, trying to figure out how I'd failed to connect with this woman who clearly meant so much to Marcus. Maybe I was too set in my ways, too stuck in the past. Maybe I needed to try harder to understand her world, her expectations. I had no idea that this dinner was just the beginning of a systematic campaign to push me out of my son's life entirely. I had no idea that Jessica had already decided I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. And I certainly had no idea that within 6 months, I'd be sleeping on a concrete floor while she planned to take everything I'd worked my entire life to build. But sitting there in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a lifetime of love and sacrifice, I still believed that family was sacred. I still believed that love could overcome any misunderstanding. I still believed that Jessica would eventually see that I wasn't her enemy, but someone who wanted nothing more than to welcome her into our family with open arms. I was about to learn just how naive those beliefs really were. The changes started small, so gradual that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Marcus began calling less frequently, our weekly Sunday conversations becoming bi-weekly, then monthly. When I'd call him, Jessica would often answer his phone with a voice dripping false concern. Oh, Dorothy, Marcus is so busy with work right now. He's under tremendous stress, and I'm really trying to protect him from any additional pressure. The implication was clear. I was additional pressure. My calls were burdens he needed protection from. When I suggested meeting for lunch or coffee, Jessica would somehow insert herself into the plans, transforming what should have been mother-son time into awkward threesomes, where she dominated the conversation and Marcus seemed to fade into the background. I started noticing how she touched him constantly when I was around, her hands always on his arm, his shoulder, his chest, marking her territory like a cat rubbing against furniture. She'd interrupt him mid-sentence when he tried to tell me about his job or his life, finishing his thoughts in ways that weren't quite accurate but somehow made him sound less capable, more dependent on her guidance. Marcus was going to make a terrible financial decision last week, she'd say with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. But fortunately, I was there to set him straight. Men are so impractical sometimes, aren't they, Dorothy? They need women to keep them grounded. Marcus would smile uncomfortably at these pronouncements, but he never contradicted her. I watched my confident, successful son gradually transform into someone who second-guessed himself, who looked to Jessica for approval before expressing any opinion, who seemed to shrink a little more each time I saw him. The real shift came when Marcus announced they were getting married. He called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice bright with forced enthusiasm. "Mom, I have wonderful news. Jessica and I are engaged." My heart should have soared. I should have been planning engagement parties and shopping for mother-of-the-groom dresses. Instead, I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach like a stone. "Oh, Marcus, that's wonderful," I managed. Because what else could I say? "When did this happen?" "Last weekend, we went to that fancy restaurant downtown, and I proposed over dessert." Jessica was so surprised she actually cried. Something about the way he told the story felt rehearsed, like he'd been coached on which details to include. In the background, I could hear Jessica's voice, though I couldn't make out the words. Marcus paused, clearly listening to her, then continued in a slightly different tone. "We're thinking about a small ceremony, just immediate family. Nothing too elaborate or expensive. Jessica thinks big weddings are wasteful." This from a woman whose handbag cost more than my monthly grocery budget. But I bit my tongue and congratulated them both, offering to help with whatever they needed. Jessica got on the phone then, her voice sugar-sweet and completely insincere. "Dorothy, I'm so excited to officially become part of the family. Marcus and I have been talking, and we really want this to be perfect. I hope you won't mind, but I've already chosen my bridesmaids, and we've selected our colors. I know how much mothers of the groom like to be involved, but honestly, I'm just so particular about my vision." My vision. Not their vision, not our family celebration, but hers alone. I was being politely but firmly excluded from my own son's wedding planning. "Of course," I said weakly. "Whatever makes you happy. You're so understanding. I knew we'd get along perfectly once we got to know each other better." But we weren't getting to know each other better. If anything, Jessica was becoming more of a stranger to me with each interaction. A beautiful, polished enigma who spoke in pleasantries while systematically erasing my presence from Marcus's life. The wedding was held at an expensive country club I'd never heard of, with 200 guests I didn't recognize. Jessica had chosen a color scheme of blush pink and gold, elegant and sophisticated and completely impersonal. I wore the navy blue dress I'd bought for my sister's funeral 3 years earlier. The nicest outfit I owned, but I felt invisible among the designer gowns and Italian suits that filled the reception hall. Marcus looked handsome in his black tuxedo, but there was something hollow in his eyes, like he was going through the motions of happiness rather than actually experiencing it. During the father-son dance, since his father had died when Marcus was 15, he'd asked me to dance instead. It should have been a beautiful moment, but Jessica watched us from the sidelines with a smile that never reached her eyes, her fingers drumming against her champagne flute in a rhythm that suggested impatience. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" I whispered to Marcus as we swayed to the music. "Of course I'm happy," he said. But he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Jessica is everything I ever wanted. I wanted to ask him what he'd wanted, because the Jessica I'd observed didn't seem to want him so much as she wanted what he represented. Marcus had a good job as an engineer, owned a nice house in a respectable neighborhood, and came from a family with solid values. On paper, he was an excellent catch for a woman looking to secure her future. But did she love him? Did she even like him? The answer came during the reception, when I overheard Jessica talking to one of her bridesmaids near the ladies' room. I'd been heading inside to touch up my lipstick when I heard my name mentioned. "Marcus's mother seems sweet enough," the bridesmaid was saying, "though that dress is positively ancient." Jessica's laugh was like broken glass. "Dorothy is exactly what you'd expect from someone who's never left that little house. She's harmless enough, I suppose, but she has no idea how to behave in civilized society." The poor thing actually offered to make the wedding cake herself. Can you imagine? I had offered to make their wedding cake. I'd been baking for 50 years, had won prizes at church competitions, had made cakes for dozens of family celebrations. But hearing Jessica dismiss my offer as the pathetic gesture of someone who didn't understand civilized society made my cheeks burn with humiliation. "Well, you won't have to deal with her too much," the bridesmaid said. "It's not like she'll be dropping by all the time." "Oh, she'll try," Jessica replied, her voice taking on a harder edge. "These clingy mothers always do, but I have plans for handling that situation. Marcus is going to learn where his loyalties really lie." I stood frozen outside that bathroom door, listening to my new daughter-in-law discuss me like I was a pest to be exterminated. The worst part wasn't her cruelty, though that cut deep enough. The worst part was realizing that I'd been naive enough to hope we could build a relationship, that I'd actually believed her polite smiles and empty compliments. Jessica had never intended to welcome me into their family. She'd been planning to eliminate me from Marcus's life from the very beginning, and I'd been too hopeful, too trusting, too desperate for my son's happiness to see what was happening right in front of me. I walked back to my table and sat through the rest of the reception with a smile plastered on my face, applauding the speeches and pretending to enjoy the 7-course dinner that tasted like sawdust in my mouth. When Marcus and Jessica left for their honeymoon in Italy, a trip that cost more than I made in 6 months, I hugged my son goodbye and wondered when I'd see him again. The answer, as it turned out, was not for another 3 months. And when I finally did see him again, he was a different person entirely. The transformation in Marcus was like watching someone fade away in slow motion. When he finally visited me after their honeymoon, he'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, his face was drawn with stress, and he kept checking his phone constantly, as if he was expecting important messages that never came. Or perhaps he was worried about messages he might receive. We sat in my living room, the same room where he'd played with toy trucks as a little boy, where we'd watched countless movies together during his teenage years, where he'd told me about his dreams of becoming an engineer. But now he perched on the edge of the sofa like he was ready to bolt at any moment, his eyes darting toward the window as if he expected Jessica to appear and catch him in some forbidden act. "Tell me about Italy," I said, trying to recapture some of the easy warmth we'd once shared. "I want to hear about everything you saw." Marcus launched into what sounded like a rehearsed description of museums and restaurants, but his enthusiasm felt forced, hollow. When I asked about his favorite moment from the trip, he paused for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. "Jessica planned everything," he finally said. "She's very good at organizing. Very efficient." Efficient. What a strange word to use when describing a honeymoon with the woman you love. I waited for him to elaborate, to share some romantic detail or funny story, but he just sat there scrolling through his phone. "Marcus," I said gently, "is everything all right? You seem distant." His head snapped up, and for a moment I saw a flash of the boy he used to be, vulnerable and seeking comfort, but then his phone buzzed, and whatever openness I'd glimpsed disappeared behind a wall of careful neutrality. "Everything's fine, Mom. Just adjusting to married life, you know. It's a big change." Before I could respond, his phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and Marcus answered it immediately, his posture straightening, as if she could see him through the device. "Hi, honey," he said, his voice taking on that artificially bright tone I'd noticed at their wedding. "No, I'm just visiting Mom like we discussed." "Yes, I remember what time dinner is. Of course I'll be home in time to change." I watched my 41-year-old son take instructions like a teenager being reminded of his curfew. When he hung up, he was already standing, reaching for his jacket. "I have to go," he said without meeting my eyes. "Jessica made reservations at that new steakhouse, and she doesn't like to be kept waiting." "Will I see you next week?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I'll call you," he said, which was what people said when they had no intention of calling. After he left, I sat in my empty house and tried to make sense of what I'd witnessed. This wasn't the natural evolution of a man growing closer to his wife. This was something else entirely, something that made my mother's heart ache with worry and frustration. But what could I do? Marcus was an adult, and he'd made his choice. If Jessica made him happy, then I had to find a way to accept it, even if I couldn't understand it. The calls stopped coming altogether after that. When I tried reaching Marcus, Jessica would answer his phone with increasingly elaborate excuses. He was in the shower, he was working late, he was dealing with a family emergency, on her side. Always something that required his immediate attention and made it impossible for him to talk to his own mother. I started driving by his house sometimes, not to spy or interfere, but just to see his car in the driveway and know he was safe. It was a beautiful house in one of the newer subdivisions, with a perfectly manicured lawn and flower beds that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Jessica's car, a sleek BMW, was always parked in the garage, while Marcus's practical Honda sat in the driveway, exposed to the weather. Even their parking arrangement seemed symbolic of their relationship. Christmas came and went without a visit. Marcus called on Christmas morning. A brief conversation filled with awkward pauses and the sound of Jessica's voice in the background, directing him through the motions of family obligation. He promised to visit soon, maybe after the holidays when things settled down, but February came and went without any sign of him. It was March when I finally swallowed my pride and decided to visit them unannounced. I'd been battling a persistent cough for weeks, and my doctor had mentioned that it might be nice to have family around while I recovered. I missed my son desperately, and I convinced myself that maybe if I made the first move, if I showed Jessica that I wasn't a threat to their marriage, we could find a way to coexist peacefully. I should have known better. I knocked on their front door at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, holding a homemade apple pie and wearing my best Sunday dress. I'd spent the morning getting ready, wanting to look presentable for Jessica's standards, hoping to make a good impression despite our rocky history. Jessica answered the door in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun that somehow managed to look effortlessly elegant. Her face went through a rapid series of expressions when she saw me: surprise, annoyance, and finally a cold calculation that made my stomach clench with dread. "Dorothy," she said, not moving from the doorway. "What a surprise." "I brought a pie," I said weakly, holding up the dish like an offering. "I thought maybe we could visit for a while. I've been missing Marcus terribly." For a long moment, Jessica just stared at me, her green eyes completely unreadable. Then she stepped back and gestured for me to come inside, though everything about her body language suggested she'd rather slam the door in my face. "Marcus is taking a nap," she said as I followed her into their pristine living room. Everything was white and beige and untouchable, like a furniture showroom, rather than a home where people actually lived. "He's been working so hard lately, putting in extra hours to pay for all the improvements we're making to the house." She gestured toward the kitchen, where I could see granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that probably cost more than I made in a year. "We're renovating everything, bringing it up to modern standards. It's expensive, but Marcus agrees that it's important to invest in our future." I sat down carefully on their white leather sofa, afraid to leave any mark or impression. "It's beautiful," I said honestly. "You have excellent taste." Jessica's smile was sharp as a knife. "Thank you. I've always believed that your environment reflects who you are as a person. Marcus is learning to appreciate the finer things in life." The implication was clear. I was not one of the finer things. My house with its outdated appliances and comfortable furniture was beneath their new standards. I was beneath their new standards. "Would you like some coffee?" Jessica asked, though her tone suggested she'd rather serve me poison. "I have an excellent Ethiopian blend. Very sophisticated." As she busied herself in the kitchen, I looked around their living room and tried to find any trace of the Marcus I knew. There were no family photos, no mementos from his childhood, no evidence that he'd ever had a life before Jessica. It was like she'd erased his entire history and replaced it with her vision of who he should be. When she returned with coffee in delicate china cups, she sat across from me and studied my face with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "Dorothy, I'm glad you're here. Marcus and I have been talking, and we think it's time we had an honest conversation about expectations." My heart began to race, though I wasn't sure why. "Expectations? About your role in our marriage," Jessica said, her voice taking on the patient tone people use when explaining simple concepts to children. "I know this is difficult for mothers to understand, but when a man gets married, his priorities have to shift. His wife becomes his primary family, and other relationships need to be adjusted accordingly. I gripped my coffee cup so tightly I was surprised it didn't shatter. I'm not trying to interfere with your marriage. I just want to see my son occasionally. Jessica's laugh was like ice cracking. Oh, Dorothy, I'm sure you think that's true. But mothers like you don't realize how suffocating your love can be. Marcus has told me all about how dependent you've been on him since his father died. How you've used guilt and manipulation to keep him tied to you. The words hit me like physical blows. Marcus had said that about me? The son I'd raised alone after my husband's death. The boy I'd worked 2 jobs to put through college. The man I'd supported through every struggle and celebrated with in every success. He thought I was manipulative and suffocating? That's not true, I whispered, but even as I said it, I wondered if maybe it was. Had I been too dependent on Marcus? Had I guilt-tripped him without realizing it? Of course it's true, Jessica said with false sympathy. But the good news is that I'm here to help him establish healthy boundaries. Marcus needs space to grow into the man he's meant to be, and frankly, your constant neediness has been holding him back. I stood up on shaking legs, the coffee cup rattling against its saucer. I should go. When Marcus wakes up, please tell him I stopped by. Actually, Jessica said, rising to block my path to the door, I think it would be better if you didn't mention this visit to Marcus. He's under so much stress right now, and I'd hate for him to feel guilty about setting boundaries with you. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for the people we love is to step back and let them live their lives. I nodded numbly and walked toward the door, leaving the apple pie on their granite countertop like an abandoned offering. As I reached for the handle, Jessica spoke again, her voice soft but deadly. Dorothy, I hope you'll think carefully about what I've said. Marcus has chosen his future, and it's with me. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone. I drove home in a daze, Jessica's words echoing in my head like a curse. By the time I reached my driveway, I'd almost convinced myself that she was right. Maybe I had been too clingy, too dependent, too unwilling to let my son live his own life. Maybe the kindest thing I could do was step back and disappear quietly, the way she wanted. It would be months before I realized that this conversation hadn't been about setting healthy boundaries. It had been about establishing absolute control. Jessica wasn't protecting Marcus from my neediness. She was isolating him from anyone who might interfere with her plans. And those plans, as I would eventually discover, went far beyond simply controlling my son's social calendar. But sitting in my car outside the house where I'd raised Marcus, where I'd bandaged his scraped knees and helped him with homework and celebrated his graduation, I felt like I was disappearing already. Jessica's vision of my role in their marriage was no role at all. I was supposed to simply vanish, as if the woman who'd given birth to Marcus and shaped his character and loved him unconditionally for 41 years had never existed in the first place. The cruelest part was that she was making me complicit in my own erasure, convincing me that stepping back was an act of love, rather than an act of surrender. And for a while, heartbroken and confused and desperate to do what was best for my son, I almost believed her. Almost. The months that followed my encounter with Jessica passed in a haze of silence and self-doubt. I found myself questioning every interaction I'd ever had with Marcus, analyzing decades of conversations for signs of the suffocating behavior Jessica had accused me of. Had I really been too dependent on my son? Had I unknowingly manipulated him with guilt and emotional blackmail? I threw myself into activities that kept me busy and away from the phone, afraid that if I called Marcus, I'd only confirm Jessica's assessment of me as needy and intrusive. I volunteered extra hours at the community center, organized my closets with obsessive precision, and spent entire afternoons in my garden, pulling weeds that didn't exist and replanting flowers that were perfectly healthy. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed the change immediately. Carmen Rodriguez had lived next door for 15 years, and we developed the kind of easy friendship that grows between women who've both raised children and buried husbands. She was the type of person who brought soup when you were sick and remembered your birthday without being reminded. Dorothy, I haven't seen that son of yours in months, she said one afternoon as we both worked in our front yards. Is everything all right? I paused in my weeding, my hands stilling on the gardening gloves that had belonged to my late husband. How could I explain that my son had essentially vanished from my life without admitting that I might have driven him away with my own neediness. Marcus is very busy with his new marriage, I said carefully. You know how it is when young people are starting their lives together. They need space to figure things out. Carmen's expression suggested she wasn't buying my cheerful explanation. Dorothy, that boy used to stop by here every week. He'd help you with your gutters, bring you groceries when the weather was bad. It's not like him to just disappear. She was right, of course. The Marcus I'd raised would never go months without checking on his mother, especially knowing that I lived alone and had no other family nearby. But Jessica's words had planted seeds of doubt that had taken root in the fertile soil of my maternal guilt. Maybe I'd been holding him back. Maybe he was happier without the burden of my constant presence in his life. People change when they get married, I said, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. I'm sure he's just adjusting to his new responsibilities. Carmen studied my face with the keen insight of someone who'd raised 5 children of her own. Dorothy, honey, you don't look like a woman whose son is happily married. You look like a woman whose heart is breaking. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote Marcus a letter. Not an email, not a text message, but an actual handwritten letter on the good stationery I'd been saving for special occasions. I told him that I loved him, that I was proud of the man he'd become, and that I wanted nothing more than his happiness. I apologized for any ways I might have overstepped boundaries, or made him feel guilty about living his own life. I promised to give him whatever space he needed, but I asked him to please not shut me out completely. I sealed the letter in an envelope and drove to his house at 7 a.m, knowing that Jessica would likely still be asleep and Marcus would be getting ready for work. I slipped it through their mail slot and drove away quickly, feeling like a criminal leaving evidence at a crime scene. Marcus never responded to the letter. Not a phone call, not a text, not even a brief email acknowledging that he'd received it. The silence was more painful than any argument we'd ever had, more devastating than any harsh words Jessica had spoken to me. It felt like erasure, like I was slowly disappearing from my son's life one day at a time. 3 more months passed without any contact. I celebrated my 73rd birthday alone, eating a single cupcake while looking at photo albums filled with pictures of Marcus at various ages. I had kept every school photo, every sports team picture, every holiday snapshot. My house was a museum of motherhood, a shrine to a relationship that apparently no longer existed. That's when I started noticing the car. It was a dark blue sedan that I didn't recognize, and it appeared on my street at odd times. Sometimes it would be parked across from my house when I left for the grocery store. Sometimes it would be there when I returned from my evening walks. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see who was inside, but something about its presence made me uneasy. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. My neighborhood was safe, full of retirees and young families who knew each other by name. Crime was virtually non-existent, and there was no reason for anyone to be watching my house. But the car continued to appear, always in different locations, but always within sight of my front door. One Tuesday morning, I decided to test my suspicions. I left my house at exactly 9 o'clock, the same time I always left for my weekly grocery run. Sure enough, the blue sedan was parked 2 houses down, partially hidden behind the Henderson's oak tree. Instead of driving to the supermarket, I made several random turns, watching my rearview mirror carefully. The sedan followed me. My hands began to shake as I drove aimlessly through residential neighborhoods, the blue car maintaining a careful distance behind me. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of a busy shopping center and sat in my car with the engine running, the sedan parked 3 rows away, close enough to keep me in sight but far enough away to avoid detection. I called the police from my cell phone, my voice trembling as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. "Ma'am, we can send an officer to check it out," she said, "but unless the person has made threats or attempted to approach you, there's not much we can do. Following someone isn't illegal if they stay on public roads." When the police car arrived, the blue sedan was gone. The officer who took my statement was polite, but clearly skeptical. "Have you been having any disputes with neighbors? Problems with contractors or service people?" Sometimes these situations turn out to be misunderstandings. I couldn't think of anyone who would want to follow me. I lived quietly, paid my bills on time, and rarely interacted with anyone beyond the basic pleasantries required for grocery shopping and doctor visits. The only conflict in my life was the situation with Jessica, but surely that wouldn't escalate to having me followed. Would it? That night, I called Carmen Rodriguez and asked if she'd noticed any strange cars in the neighborhood. As a matter of fact, I have, she said, her voice taking on a concerned tone. There was a blue sedan parked outside your house yesterday morning. I thought maybe you had a visitor, but when I looked again an hour later, the car was still there, and your car was gone. The next few weeks became a careful dance of paranoia and observation. I started varying my routines, leaving at different times and taking different routes to familiar destinations. Sometimes the blue sedan was there, sometimes it wasn't. But I began to notice other things that made my unease grow into genuine fear. My mail was being delivered later than usual, and sometimes letters I was expecting never arrived. The community center called to ask why I'd missed my volunteer shift, though I'd never committed to working that day. My doctor's office rescheduled an appointment I'd never made, and the pharmacist mentioned that someone had called asking about my prescription medications. Someone was making inquiries about my life, my habits, my health. Someone was trying to learn my schedule and routines. But who and why? The answer came on a rainy Thursday in November when I saw Marcus's car in my driveway. My heart leaped with joy and relief. Finally, my son had come to see me. Maybe Jessica had realized that her campaign to isolate me was causing more harm than good. Maybe Marcus had decided that cutting his mother out of his life wasn't the solution to whatever problems they were having. I hurried to the front door, smoothing my hair and trying to compose myself. I didn't want to seem too eager, too desperate for his attention. I wanted to appear calm and collected, the kind of mother who could respect boundaries while still maintaining a loving relationship with her son. But the man who stood on my porch wasn't the Marcus I remembered. This version of my son was thinner, more drawn, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that reminded me of a cornered animal. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his hands shook slightly as he shifted from foot to foot. "Hi, Mom," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Can I come in?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, stepping back to let him enter. "I'm so happy to see you. Are you all right? You look tired." Marcus walked into my living room but didn't sit down. Instead, he paced near the window, occasionally glancing outside as if he expected someone to appear. "I can't stay long," he said. "Jessica thinks I'm at the hardware store." The fact that he had to lie to his wife about visiting his own mother sent a chill down my spine. "Marcus, what's going on? Why haven't you called? I sent you a letter months ago, and you never responded." He stopped pacing and finally looked at me directly. What I saw in his eyes made my breath catch in my throat. It was fear, raw and desperate, the kind of terror that comes from being trapped with no way out. "Mom, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I need you to promise me you won't do anything about it. Promise me you'll just listen and then forget we ever had this conversation." I nodded, though every maternal instinct I possessed was screaming that something was terribly wrong. "I promise." Marcus sat down heavily on my sofa, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles were white. "Jessica isn't who you think she is," he began. "She isn't who I thought she was either. By the time I figured it out, it was too late." He told me things that made my blood run cold. Jessica had been researching him for months before they'd met, learning about his job, his finances, his family situation. Their chance encounter at a coffee shop had been carefully orchestrated. She deliberately sought him out because he fit a specific profile: successful, lonely, recently out of a long-term relationship, with an aging mother and no other close family ties. "She calls it asset management," Marcus said, his voice hollow with shame. "She finds men like me, men who are vulnerable and isolated, and she becomes exactly what they think they want. Then she systematically takes control of every aspect of their lives." Jessica had convinced Marcus to add her name to his bank accounts within 3 months of their engagement. She'd persuaded him to take out loans against his house for improvements that never materialized. She'd isolated him from friends and colleagues, claiming they were bad influences or didn't understand their relationship. The wedding cost $70,000, Marcus continued. Money that came from my retirement accounts. She said it was an investment in our future, that we needed to make the right impression on her family and friends. But her family didn't even come to the wedding, Mom. Those people were hired actors. I felt sick to my stomach as the pieces began falling into place. Marcus, why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you come to me sooner? He laughed bitterly. Because she convinced me that you were the problem. She showed me articles about narcissistic mothers and emotionally incestuous relationships. She made me believe that my love for you was unhealthy, that I needed to choose between her and you. And I chose her because I thought I was in love. But you know better now, I said gently. You can leave her. You can get help. Marcus shook his head. It's not that simple. She has copies of emails that she says I sent to underage girls. Inappropriate emails that would destroy my career if they ever surfaced. Except I never sent them, Mom. She created them somehow, but they look completely real. If I try to leave her or expose what she's doing, she'll destroy me. The room seemed to spin around me as I processed what my son was telling me. Jessica wasn't just a manipulative wife. She was a predator who specialized in financial and emotional abuse. And she'd chosen Marcus as her victim because she'd identified him as someone with assets worth stealing, and few people who would notice his gradual disappearance from their lives. There's more, Marcus said, glancing nervously at his watch. She's been asking about you, Mom. About your house, your finances, your health. She wants to know if you have any savings, any life insurance policies, any property that might be valuable. I think she's planning something. The blue sedan suddenly made sense. Jessica had been having me followed, studying my routines, gathering information about my vulnerabilities. But why? What could she possibly want from a retired seamstress living on Social Security? Marcus, we have to go to the police, I said. What she's doing is illegal. The financial fraud alone could send her to prison. With what proof? Marcus asked desperately. She's too smart to leave evidence lying around. Everything looks legitimate on paper. I voluntarily added her to my accounts. I willingly took out those loans. Any emails or documents that might incriminate her have disappeared. And if I accuse her, she'll release those fake emails and claim I'm having a mental breakdown. He stood up abruptly, smoothing his shirt and checking his appearance in the mirror above my mantel. I have to go. She times my errands, and if I'm gone too long, she'll start asking questions. Don't go back there, I pleaded. Stay here with me. We'll figure this out together. Marcus looked at me with such sadness that it broke my heart. Mom, if I don't go back, she'll assume I've told you everything. And then she'll accelerate whatever timeline she has for you. At least this way, I can try to protect you from the inside. He kissed my forehead, a gesture so familiar and comforting that tears began streaming down my face. I love you, Mom. I'm sorry I let her convince me that you were the problem. You were the best mother anyone could ask for, and I've been an idiot. I love you too, sweetheart, I whispered. We'll find a way out of this. After he left, I sat in my living room and tried to process everything I'd learned. My son was trapped in an abusive marriage with a woman who was systematically destroying his life. Jessica had been having me followed and investigating my finances for reasons I couldn't fathom, and according to Marcus, she was planning something that involved me directly. I thought about the life insurance policy Harold had taken out before his death, the modest savings account I'd been building for 20 years, the house that was finally paid off after decades of mortgage payments. To Jessica, these might seem like significant assets worth pursuing, but she had no idea about the real secret I'd been keeping. She had no idea about the safety deposit box downtown, or the stock certificates it contained, or the fact that Harold's seemingly worthless investment in a tiny tech company had grown into a fortune worth over $2 million. She had no idea that the frail old woman she was targeting was actually a millionaire who'd been quietly sitting on a nest egg that could change everything. But if Jessica was planning to harm me or my son, she was about to discover that she'd picked the wrong family to mess with. I'd been passive and accommodating for too long, allowing her to manipulate and isolate us while I questioned my own instincts and blamed myself for the breakdown in my relationship with Marcus. That was about to change. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for David Chen, the attorney who'd handled Harold's estate when he passed away. It was time to stop being a victim and start being strategic. Jessica might be smart and manipulative, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated a mother's love for her child. And that was going to cost her everything. The next morning, I called in sick to my volunteer work and drove downtown to meet with David Chen. I dressed carefully for the meeting, wearing my best suit and the pearl necklace Harold had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look like someone who deserved to be taken seriously, not a confused elderly woman with paranoid delusions. David's office was in one of the older buildings downtown, with high ceilings and rich wood paneling that spoke of tradition and competence. He was in his 60s now, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been Harold's friend before becoming our attorney, and I trusted him more than almost anyone else in the world. "Dorothy, it's wonderful to see you," he said, rising from behind his massive desk to give me a gentle hug. "Though I have to admit, your phone call yesterday has me concerned. You mentioned that you needed to discuss security measures?" I settled into the leather chair across from his desk and took a deep breath. "David, I need to tell you about some things that have been happening, and I need your advice about how to protect myself and my son." For the next hour, I told him everything. Jessica's manipulation of Marcus, the systematic isolation, the financial fraud, the surveillance, and Marcus's visit the previous day. David listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "Dorothy, what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated long-term fraud operation," he said when I finished. "These people target victims with specific profiles and then systematically drain their resources while maintaining plausible deniability." "But why would she be interested in me?" I asked. "I live on Social Security and a small pension. I'm hardly a lucrative target." David looked at me carefully. "Dorothy, you do realize that your net worth is substantial, don't you? The stocks Harold invested in before his death have performed extremely well over the past 15 years. Your portfolio is worth approximately $1 million. I nodded. "I know, I've been tracking the value, and I understand that I'm financially secure. But Jessica doesn't know about those investments. How could she?" "These people are very good at research," David explained. "They might have accessed records that show Harold's original investments, or they might have found evidence of dividend payments. It's also possible that Marcus mentioned something about your financial situation without realizing the implications." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "Dorothy, if this woman is as dangerous as you believe, then you need to take immediate steps to protect yourself. We need to document everything, create a paper trail, and establish safeguards that will make it impossible for her to access your assets." We spent the next 2 hours developing a comprehensive protection plan. David would file paperwork to transfer my investments to accounts that only I could access, with multiple authentication requirements. We'd create a detailed written record of everything I knew about Jessica's activities, including dates, times, and witnesses when possible. Most importantly, we'd establish protocols that would alert authorities if anything happened to me. "I'm also going to refer you to a private investigator," David said, "someone who specializes in financial fraud cases. If Jessica has done this before, there might be other victims who could provide evidence of her methods." The private investigator was a woman named Patricia Wells, a former police detective who'd started her own agency after retiring from the force. She had gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen everything and wasn't easily fooled. "Your attorney filled me in on the basics," she said when we met at her office later that week. "I've dealt with cases like this before, and I have to tell you, the victim profile your son fits is very specific. These predators look for men who are successful but socially isolated, usually with aging parents and significant assets." Patricia had already begun preliminary research on Jessica Monroe, and what she'd found was disturbing. "The name Jessica Monroe doesn't exist before 3 years ago," she explained. "No birth certificate, no school records, no employment history. It's a completely fabricated identity." She showed me printouts of various documents, all pointing to the conclusion that my daughter-in-law was living under an assumed name. "I've identified at least 2 other men in different states who were involved with women matching Jessica's description. Both cases involved financial fraud, isolation from family members, and eventual disappearance of significant assets. What happened to those men? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. One committed suicide after being charged with possession of child pornography that he swore he'd never downloaded. The other disappeared entirely. His family believes he's dead, but no body was ever found. The room seemed to tilt around me as I processed the implications. Jessica wasn't just a financial predator. She was someone who destroyed lives completely and permanently. And she had my son trapped in her web, isolated and terrified, with no way to escape without destroying himself in the process. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to understand something, Patricia said gently. If your son is right about Jessica's timeline, then you could be in immediate physical danger. These people don't leave witnesses, and they don't leave loose ends. If she's researching your assets and monitoring your activities, it's because she's planning something permanent. I thought about the blue sedan, the strange phone calls, the mail that had gone missing. Jessica had been studying me like a scientist studies a lab rat, learning my patterns and vulnerabilities. But for what purpose? What do you think she's planning? I asked. Patricia's expression was grim. Given her history, I'd guess she's looking for a way to make your death appear accidental or natural. A fall down the stairs, a car accident, a medical emergency that could be attributed to your age. Once you're gone, Marcus would inherit whatever assets you have, and as his wife, she'd have access to everything. The cold calculation of it took my breath away. Jessica had never seen me as a person, only as an obstacle between her and my money. She'd been planning my death from the moment she realized I had assets worth stealing. But she doesn't know about the full extent of your wealth, Patricia continued, which gives us an advantage. If she thinks you're only worth whatever she can see on the surface, she might not be prepared for the kind of legal firepower that serious money can buy. Over the next several days, Patricia and I developed a comprehensive counter-strategy. We'd document Jessica's surveillance activities, gather evidence of her financial crimes against Marcus, and build a case that could be presented to law enforcement. Most importantly, we'd use resources Jessica didn't know I had to turn the tables on her investigation. The key is to make her think she's still in control while we gather evidence, Patricia explained. If she realizes we're onto her, she might accelerate her timeline, or simply disappear and start over somewhere else with a new identity. I hired a security company to install cameras around my house, disguised as decorative fixtures that wouldn't attract attention. I began carrying a GPS tracker and a panic button that would alert both Patricia and the police if I was in danger. Most importantly, I started documenting everything, creating a detailed record of Jessica's activities that could be used as evidence if something happened to me. But the hardest part was maintaining the pretense that nothing had changed. When Jessica called my house, pretending to check on my welfare while actually gathering information, I had to sound like the same confused, isolated old woman she expected me to be. "Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me calling," she said during one of these conversations, her voice dripping with false concern. "Marcus mentioned that you seemed a little confused when he saw you last week. I wanted to make sure you were taking care of yourself." Marcus hadn't mentioned anything about me being confused because he knew I wasn't. This was Jessica's way of establishing a narrative that would support whatever she was planning. If I died under suspicious circumstances, she'd already laid the groundwork to suggest that I'd been suffering from dementia or other age-related mental decline. "I'm feeling fine, dear," I said, forcing warmth into my voice, "though I have been a little forgetful lately. Just the normal things that come with getting older, I suppose." "Of course," Jessica replied, and I could practically hear her smile through the phone. "It's so important for people your age to have support systems. It's such a shame that you don't have more family nearby." She was fishing for information about my social connections, trying to determine whether anyone would notice if I suddenly disappeared or died unexpectedly. I gave her what she wanted to hear, painting a picture of an isolated elderly woman with no close friends and minimal contact with the outside world. But while I was playing the role of a vulnerable victim, Patricia was building a case that would destroy Jessica's carefully constructed facade. The private investigator had identified 3 more potential victims in different states, all following the same pattern of financial fraud and emotional manipulation. More importantly, she'd found evidence that Jessica's real name was Linda Hartley, and that she had a criminal record dating back 15 years. Multiple arrests for fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse, though she'd always managed to avoid serious prison time by disappearing before cases could be fully prosecuted. She's been doing this for a long time, Patricia explained during one of our weekly meetings, and she's gotten very good at it. But she's also gotten overconfident, and that's going to be her downfall. The break we'd been waiting for came when Patricia's surveillance team photographed Jessica meeting with a man outside a downtown hotel. The man, identified as Robert Chen, was a former medical technician who'd lost his license for falsifying patient records. He specialized in making deaths appear natural, using drugs and techniques that were difficult to detect in standard autopsies. "This is it," Patricia said, showing me the photographs. "This is proof that she's planning something immediate. Robert Chen doesn't take social meetings, and he doesn't work cheap. If Jessica is meeting with him, it's because she's ready to move to the final phase of her plan." My hands shook as I looked at the pictures. Jessica looked beautiful and composed as always, discussing my murder with the same casual efficiency she might use to plan a dinner party. She had no idea that her conversation was being recorded, or that her carefully laid plans were about to unravel completely. "What do we do now?" I asked. Patricia smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a surge of hope. "Now we spring our trap. It's time to show Jessica Monroe exactly who she's been underestimating." The plan was both simple and elegant. Patricia would arrange for me to have a very public medical emergency at the grocery store, complete with an ambulance ride to the hospital and concerned bystanders. While Jessica thought I was hospitalized and vulnerable, we'd monitor her activities and gather evidence of any attempts to access my home or my finances. More importantly, we'd use the opportunity to execute the final phase of our counter strategy. David Chen had prepared legal documents that would expose Jessica's crimes and protect Marcus from any retaliation. Once we had solid evidence of her murderous intentions, we'd present everything to law enforcement and let the justice system take its course. But first, I had to play my part convincingly. I had to make Jessica believe that her plan was working, that the frail old woman she'd been targeting was finally within her grasp. I had no idea that she was already moving faster than we'd anticipated. And I had no idea that by the time I returned from my fake hospital stay, she'd already convinced my son to sign papers that would give her power of attorney over all my affairs. The game was about to change in ways none of us had predicted. The fake medical emergency was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Millfield Grocery, the store where I'd shopped every week for the past 20 years. Patricia had coached me on how to make the collapse look genuine without actually injuring myself, and she'd positioned her surveillance team throughout the store to document everything that happened afterward. I walked slowly down the cereal aisle, my heart pounding with nervousness and anticipation. At exactly 10:15, as planned, I let my knees buckle and fell to the linoleum floor, clutching my chest and gasping for air. The performance felt surprisingly natural, perhaps because the stress of recent weeks had left me genuinely exhausted and fragile. Within minutes, concerned shoppers had gathered around me, store employees were calling for an ambulance, and I was being loaded onto a stretcher with oxygen mask covering my face. Through half-closed eyes, I watched Patricia blend seamlessly into the crowd of worried bystanders, her phone recording every detail. The ambulance ride to Mercy General Hospital was the most terrifying part of the charade. The paramedics were genuinely concerned about my condition, running tests and asking questions that I had to answer carefully to maintain the illusion of a cardiac episode without actually claiming to have one. By the time we reached the emergency room, I was beginning to wonder if this elaborate deception was worth the risk. Dr. Miranda Foster, the emergency physician Patricia had recruited for our plan, met us at the ambulance bay. She was a tall woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes, someone Patricia trusted completely from her days on the police force. Dr. Foster examined me thoroughly, ordered a battery of tests, and then informed my family that I would need to be admitted for observation. The family member she called was Marcus, whose number was listed as my emergency contact. I could only imagine his panic when he received the call about my hospitalization, especially knowing what Jessica was planning. But this was necessary to make our trap believable. Jessica needed to think that I was vulnerable, and that her opportunity had finally arrived. Marcus arrived at the hospital within an hour, looking genuinely distraught as he hurried into my room. His concern was so authentic that for a moment I almost broke character to reassure him that I was fine. But Jessica was right behind him, her face a perfect mask of worry and sympathy. "Oh, Dorothy, you gave us such a fright," she said, taking my hand with what appeared to be genuine tenderness. When Marcus got the call, we rushed right over. "How are you feeling?" I managed a weak smile and spoke in a voice made deliberately frail by the oxygen mask. "I've been better, dear. The doctors say they need to run more tests. I'm so sorry to worry you both." Jessica squeezed my hand, and I noticed how her eyes quickly scanned the medical equipment around my bed, taking inventory of my condition and the hospital's security measures. She was already calculating, already planning her next move. "Don't you worry about anything," she said with perfect sincerity. "Marcus and I will take care of everything while you focus on getting better. You just rest and let us handle all the details." Marcus looked uncomfortable with this proclamation, but he didn't contradict his wife. I could see the internal struggle playing out across his face, the desire to comfort his mother warring with his fear of Jessica's retaliation. Over the next 3 days, while I remained in the hospital under Dr. Foster's care, Patricia's surveillance team documented Jessica's activities with military precision. True to form, she wasted no time putting her plan into motion. On the first day, she visited my house with a locksmith, claiming to neighbors that she needed to secure the property while I was hospitalized. Carmen Rodriguez, who'd been briefed on our operation, watched from her kitchen window as Jessica systematically searched my home, looking for documents, valuables, and evidence of hidden assets. Patricia's hidden cameras captured everything. Jessica found my bank statements, insurance policies, and the deed to my house. She photographed everything with her cell phone, clearly building a comprehensive picture of my financial situation. What she didn't find, of course, were any records of Harold's investment accounts or the safety deposit box downtown. On the second day, Jessica convinced Marcus to sign power of attorney documents that would give her legal authority to make decisions on my behalf if I became incapacitated. The papers had been prepared by an attorney I'd never heard of, someone who specialized in elder law and had a reputation for asking few questions when the fees were substantial enough. Marcus signed reluctantly, believing he was protecting me from potential complications if my condition worsened. He had no idea that Jessica had added clauses giving her immediate access to my financial accounts and the authority to make medical decisions without consulting him. By the third day, Jessica had taken control of my checkbook, contacted my insurance company to inquire about policy details, and scheduled a meeting with a real estate agent to discuss the potential sale of my house. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before, systematically dismantling my life while maintaining the facade of a devoted daughter-in-law caring for an ailing relative. But while Jessica thought she was executing the perfect crime, Patricia was building an ironclad case against her. Every phone call was recorded, every document photographed, every meeting with accomplices documented by surveillance teams that Jessica never noticed. The most damaging evidence came when Patricia's team followed Jessica to her meeting with Robert Chen, the disgraced medical technician. The conversation took place in Chen's car in an empty parking garage, but Patricia's directional microphones captured every word. "The old woman is in the hospital now," Jessica said, her voice cold and businesslike. "She's weak, confused, probably won't last much longer anyway. This is our chance to make it look natural." Chen's response chilled me to the bone when Patricia played the recording for me later. "Heart patients are tricky. Too much of the drug and it's obvious on autopsy. Too little and she recovers. But I've got something new that mimics a stroke. Completely undetectable unless they specifically test for it, which they won't in a woman her age." "How long after administration?" Jessica asked. 6 to 8 hours. Plenty of time for you to establish an alibi. And it'll look like she had the stroke at home after being discharged from the hospital. Very believable given her recent cardiac issues. They discussed payment, timing, and logistics with the casual efficiency of professionals arranging a business transaction. Jessica would pay Chen $50,000 for the drug and his silence. Chen would provide detailed instructions for administering it without detection. Most sickeningly, they discussed what would happen after my death. Jessica had already researched probate procedures and identified the fastest way to convert my assets to cash. She estimated that between my house, insurance policies, and visible savings accounts, she could clear at least $400,000 within 6 months of my death. If only she knew the real number was closer to $3 million. That night, as I lay in my hospital bed listening to Patricia's recordings, I felt a rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This woman hadn't just stolen my son and isolated me from my family. She was planning to murder me for money, then comfort Marcus through his grief while secretly celebrating her windfall. But Jessica had made one crucial error. She'd underestimated not just my financial resources, but my determination to protect my son. And now that I had concrete evidence of her murderous intentions, I was ready to destroy her completely. Dr. Foster discharged me on Thursday morning with instructions to take it easy and follow up with my regular physician within the week. Jessica and Marcus picked me up from the hospital, Jessica fussing over me with elaborate concern while Marcus remained uncharacteristically quiet. "We've set up the guest room at our house so you can stay with us while you recover," Jessica announced as we drove through the city. "I know you value your independence, but after a scare like this, you really shouldn't be alone." My blood ran cold. Staying at their house would put me completely under Jessica's control, with no witnesses and no escape routes. It would be the perfect opportunity for her to administer Chen's drug and make my death appear to be a natural consequence of my recent cardiac issues. "That's very kind of you, dear," I said carefully, "but I think I'd be more comfortable in my own home. I'll be fine with some rest." Jessica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dorothy, I really think it would be better if someone could keep an eye on you. What if you have another episode? What if you fall and can't reach the phone?" Marcus finally spoke up, though his voice lacked conviction. "Mom, maybe Jessica's right. It might be safer if you stayed with us for a few days." I could see Jessica's hand on his thigh, her fingers digging into his leg in a warning squeeze. My son was trapped between his genuine concern for my welfare and his fear of his wife's retaliation. I couldn't put him in the impossible position of choosing between us, not when I had other options. "Well," I said slowly, as if the idea had just occurred to me, "I suppose a few days wouldn't hurt, but I'll need to stop by my house first to pick up some clothes and medications." Jessica's relief was palpable. "Of course! We'll stop there right now and get whatever you need." As we pulled into my driveway, I noticed the blue sedan parked across the street, though I pretended not to see it. Jessica's surveillance team was still monitoring my movements, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. They had no idea that Patricia's counter-surveillance team was watching them from 3 different positions. Inside my house, I moved slowly and deliberately, playing the role of a frail woman still recovering from a cardiac episode. Jessica helped me pack a small suitcase, her hands lingering on my medication bottles as she organized them in a travel case. I had no doubt she was noting the names and dosages, information that would help her determine the best way to administer Chen's drug without detection. While Jessica was distracted in my bedroom, Marcus approached me in the hallway. His face was pale with strain, and his hands shook as he helped me steady myself against the wall. "Mom," he whispered urgently, "don't eat or drink anything Jessica gives you. Please, promise me." Before I could respond, Jessica's voice rang out from the bedroom. "Marcus, could you help me find your mother's insurance cards? They should be in her purse." Marcus's warning confirmed what I already knew. He was aware of Jessica's plans but felt powerless to stop them. He was trying to protect me in the only way he could, but he had no idea that I was already 3 steps ahead of his wife's deadly game. The guest room at Marcus and Jessica's house was decorated in the same sterile, magazine-perfect style as the rest of their home. Everything was white and beige and untouchable, like a hotel suite designed for someone who wouldn't be staying long, which, of course, was exactly what Jessica had in mind. She settled me into bed with elaborate care, fluffing pillows and adjusting the temperature, and making sure I had everything I needed for a comfortable night's rest. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, the devoted daughter-in-law caring for her husband's ailing mother. "I've prepared some chamomile tea to help you sleep," she said, carrying in a delicate china cup on a matching saucer. "And I've set out your evening medications. The doctor said it was important to maintain your regular schedule." The tea smelled lovely, fragrant with herbs and honey. But remembering Marcus's warning, I accepted the cup with grateful thanks and set it on the bedside table without drinking any of it. Jessica's eyes followed my movements carefully, noting that the tea remained untouched. "Aren't you going to drink it while it's warm?" she asked with false concern. "I made it especially for you." "I will in just a moment, dear. I'm still feeling a bit queasy from the hospital medications. Let me settle in first." Jessica's smile remained fixed, but I caught a flicker of irritation in her eyes. She'd expected me to drink the tea immediately, and my hesitation was disrupting her timeline. I had no doubt that Chen's drug was already dissolved in the fragrant brew, waiting to send me into an undetectable coma within hours. "Well, don't wait too long," she said, backing toward the door. "Tea is much more effective when it's hot. And you really do need your rest." After she left, I waited several minutes before getting up and dumping the tea into the bathroom sink. The liquid disappeared down the drain, taking Jessica's first murder attempt with it. But I knew she wouldn't give up easily. She'd simply try a different method, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. Patricia had given me a small device that looked like a hearing aid but was actually a GPS tracker and emergency transmitter. If Jessica made another attempt on my life, I could activate it with a simple touch, alerting Patricia's team and summoning immediate help. More importantly, the device would record everything that happened, providing legal evidence of Jessica's crimes. I pretended to sleep, lying still in the unfamiliar bed while monitoring the sounds of the house around me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. The guest room had no lock, and the doorknob turned slowly as someone entered without knocking. Jessica crept into the room carrying something in her hand, her movements careful and deliberate in the darkness. I forced myself to breathe slowly and evenly, feigning the deep sleep of someone under sedation. Through barely opened eyes, I watched her approach the bed. She was carrying a syringe. Chen's backup plan, apparently, was a direct injection that would mimic the effects of a stroke. Jessica planned to administer the drug while I slept, then dispose of the syringe, and wait for the drug to take effect. By morning, she would discover my body and call 911, playing the grief-stricken daughter-in-law who'd done everything she could to care for her husband's beloved mother. But as Jessica reached for my arm, I opened my eyes and looked directly at her. "I know what you're doing," I said quietly. Jessica froze, the syringe still in her hand, her face a mask of shock and calculation. For a moment, we stared at each other in the darkness, predator and prey locked in a final confrontation. Then Jessica's expression hardened into something cold and deadly. "You should have minded your own business, old woman." She lunged toward me with the syringe, but I was ready for her. I rolled away from her grasp, while simultaneously pressing the emergency button on Patricia's device. Within seconds, alarms would be sounding in Patricia's monitoring station, and help would be on the way. But seconds might be too long. Jessica was younger, stronger, and desperate. She grabbed my wrist, trying to hold me still while she positioned the syringe. I fought back with every ounce of strength I possessed, fueled by decades of maternal protectiveness and righteous fury. "Marcus!" I screamed, hoping to wake my son and bring him running. "Marcus, help me!" Jessica's hand clamped over my mouth, muffling my cries. "He can't hear you," she hissed. "I gave him sleeping pills with dinner. He won't wake up until it's all over." The syringe was inches from my arm when the bedroom door burst open and Patricia Wells stormed in with 2 police officers behind her. Jessica spun around, still clutching the syringe, her face wild with panic and rage. "Drop the weapon!" one of the officers commanded, his gun drawn and pointed at Jessica's chest. "Step away from Mrs. Patterson immediately!" For a moment, I thought Jessica might try to complete her mission anyway, might attempt to inject me with the deadly drug even knowing she'd been caught. But faced with 3 armed professionals, she finally released her grip and let the syringe fall to the floor. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, instantly switching back to her concerned daughter-in-law persona. "I was trying to give Dorothy her insulin. She's diabetic, and she forgot to take her evening injection. But Patricia was recording everything, and the syringe would reveal Chen's poison rather than any legitimate medication. Jessica's lies were finally catching up with her, and there was no performance skillful enough to explain away attempted murder caught on camera. The next several hours passed in a blur of police statements, evidence collection, and medical examinations. The syringe contained a synthetic compound that would have induced a massive stroke within hours, just as Chen had promised. Jessica's fingerprints were all over the device, and Patricia's recordings provided irrefutable evidence of premeditation. Marcus woke up the next morning to find his house filled with police officers and his wife in handcuffs. The sleeping pills Jessica had given him were still in his system, making him groggy and confused, as detectives explained what had happened during the night. "She tried to kill Mom?" he asked repeatedly, as if he couldn't process the information. "She actually tried to murder her?" I held my son while he cried, feeling the weight of months of manipulation and fear finally lifting from his shoulders. Jessica had controlled him through terror and isolation, but now her hold on him was broken. He was free to remember who he really was, free to rebuild the relationships she'd systematically destroyed. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Jessica's criminal enterprise. Her real name was Linda Marie Hartley, and she had a 20-year history of targeting vulnerable men with financial assets. 7 different victims across 5 states, all following the same pattern of seduction, isolation, financial fraud, and eventually murder or disappearance. The fake emails she'd used to blackmail Marcus were traced to a sophisticated identity theft operation that created compromising evidence against victims who tried to escape her control. Robert Chen, the medical technician, confessed to providing murder weapons for at least 4 of Jessica's previous crimes in exchange for substantial payments. But the most satisfying revelation came when Patricia's forensic accountants traced Jessica's financial activities. She'd hidden over $3 million in offshore accounts, money stolen from her previous victims. Under asset forfeiture laws, that money would be returned to surviving family members or donated to victim assistance programs. Jessica herself would face multiple charges of attempted murder, financial fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. With the evidence Patricia had gathered, including recordings of her planning my death, she was looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole. Marcus spent weeks in therapy, working through the trauma of psychological abuse and beginning the process of reclaiming his identity. The man who'd been isolated and terrorized slowly emerged as someone stronger and wiser, someone who'd learned to recognize manipulation and stand up to it. "I can't believe I let her convince me that you were the problem," he said during one of our conversations as he helped me repaint my kitchen. "You were the one person who truly loved me unconditionally, and I let her turn me against you." "You were a victim too, sweetheart," I reminded him. "She was very good at what she did. The important thing is that we both survived, and now we can rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth." The financial aftermath of Jessica's crimes was complicated, but David Chen's careful planning ensured that my assets remained protected throughout the ordeal. The power of attorney documents Jessica had tricked Marcus into signing were invalidated due to fraud, and I maintained complete control of my $2 million portfolio. More importantly, I'd learned that I was far stronger than I'd ever imagined. The woman who'd doubted herself, who'd wondered if she was too needy or manipulative, had orchestrated the downfall of a sophisticated predator. I'd protected my son and myself using intelligence, resources, and the kind of determined love that Jessica had never understood. 6 months after Jessica's arrest, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I sold my house and moved to a luxury senior living community across town, a place with beautiful gardens, engaging activities, and a social environment that encouraged new friendships. I'd spent too many years living small, convincing myself that I didn't deserve more than basic comfort and security. But discovering my hidden wealth had also revealed my hidden potential. I was a 73-year-old woman with resources, intelligence, and decades of life experience. There was no reason to waste those gifts hiding in my old house, protecting assets I'd been too afraid to enjoy. The money Harold had invested so carefully would now fund adventures I'd never imagined possible. I planned trips to Europe, enrolled in art classes, and even started a scholarship fund for children of single mothers, knowing firsthand how difficult it could be to raise a family alone. Marcus visited me every Sunday, bringing flowers and stories about his new life. He'd started dating again, cautiously but optimistically, having learned to recognize the difference between genuine affection and calculated manipulation. We'd grown closer than ever, bonded by the shared experience of surviving Jessica's predations. Carmen Rodriguez moved into the senior community as well, and we became official best friends instead of just neighbors. We spent our afternoons gossiping about the other residents, planning group activities, and marveling at how our lives had changed so dramatically in such a short time. "Who would have thought," Carmen said one afternoon as we sat by the community pool, "that getting rid of one terrible daughter-in-law would lead to such an adventure?" I laughed, thinking about the woman I'd been just a year earlier, isolated and doubting herself, sleeping on a garage floor while Jessica planned her murder. That woman had felt powerless and invisible, unworthy of love or respect. But she'd been wrong about everything. She'd had power beyond her wildest dreams, hidden in Harold's careful investments. She'd had love that transcended any manipulation, demonstrated by her son's ultimate loyalty and her community's support. And she'd had strength that no predator could break, rooted in decades of survival and sacrifice. Jessica had seen an easy target, a frail old woman with modest assets, and no one to protect her. She'd had no idea she was taking on a mother with $2 million, and the determination to use every penny of it to destroy anyone who threatened her family. The garage where Jessica had forced me to sleep was now being used by its rightful purpose, storing garden tools and holiday decorations. But sometimes, when I visited Marcus at his house, I'd look at that concrete floor and remember the night that changed everything. I'd been at my lowest point, humiliated and homeless in my own family, convinced that I deserved the treatment I was receiving. But even then, even sleeping on cold concrete with nothing but a thin blanket for comfort, I'd had resources that could change everything. I just hadn't known how to use them yet. Jessica Monroe, or Linda Hartley, or whatever her real name might have been, had spent her career underestimating people. She'd seen Marcus as a weak man desperate for love. She'd seen me as a helpless old woman with nowhere to turn. She'd been wrong about both of us, and that mistake had cost her everything, while giving me the opportunity to finally become the woman I was always meant to be. Rich in resources, rich in relationships, and rich in the kind of confidence that comes from discovering you're far stronger than anyone ever imagined, including yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.